The Russian submarine K-152 Nerpa was 300 feet beneath the Sea of Japan when a sailor on board noticed something strange. First one, then another, then another. Men were crumpling to the floor. Terror spread as hatches automatically slammed shut, trapping sailors inside. Something invisible was ripping through the vessel. The Akula-class nuclear attack submarine was only supposed to have a crew of 90, but now it carried over 200 souls into the darkness during its November 2008 sea trial. Alarms began to wail. However, the warnings, the indicators, nothing made sense. As the crew scrambled to grasp what was really going on, they couldn't be sure if K-152 was trying to tell them something or trying to kill them. The truth would almost be beyond belief. Going nuclear. On September 30th, 1954, the United States launched a naval weapon unlike any other before it. At Groton, Connecticut, USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, was commissioned under the command of Eugene P. Wilkinson. While diesel-electric submarines had to surface regularly to recharge, this new breed could stay submerged indefinitely, its only limitation being the crew's endurance. Months prior, Nautilus had already proven its capabilities, embarking on a 1,381-mile submerged journey from New London, Connecticut to Puerto Rico in under 4 days. In 1959, this new weapon got a lethal upgrade when it was paired with nuclear missiles. These underwater hunters were now capable of launching nuclear strikes from the depths of the ocean if needed. Suddenly, no city was safe. The Soviet Union watched in alarm. USS Nautilus had changed the rules of warfare, and Moscow knew it could not afford to lag. By the end of the decade, Soviet engineers scrambled to catch up, rolling out their first nuclear-powered submarines, the November-class. If Cold War tensions kept increasing and led to full-scale war, these vessels would be responsible for stalking and destroying enemy warships, serving as the Soviet Union's underwater hitmen. Soviet nuclear submarines proliferated in the following years. By the 1980s, Moscow had seemingly beaten the Americans at their own game. With over 400 vessels at their disposal, the Soviet Union now possessed the biggest submarine fleet in the world, outnumbering and in some cases even outpacing the US in technology. At moments, some of the Soviets' newest vessels could dive deeper and sprint through the ocean faster than their American counterparts. Emboldened by its growing strength, the Soviet Union launched Operation Atrina in the spring of 1987. During the mission, 5 Victor III-class attack submarines slipped from their Kola base, racing toward U.S. naval installations along the Atlantic coast. Unlike previous Soviet submarines, the Victor III-class were harder to detect at long distances. With a near-silent acoustic signature, these vessels evaded long-range surveillance, allowing Moscow to attempt something unprecedented, a large-scale operation aimed at tracking one of the recently deployed American Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines, a critical pillar of U.S. nuclear defense. The Soviets headed straight for Norfolk, Virginia, where the submarine USS Nevada was stationed. She was considered an especially valuable target, having just received new anti-submarine warfare upgrades. If Victor III were to find her, the Soviets would gain a dangerous intelligence advantage. Worse still, at the moment, Nevada was unarmed, and if the enemy opted for a more aggressive approach, there was no way for the sub to defend herself. Fortunately for the Americans, NATO forces had identified the incoming Victor III submarines and warned the crew of Nevada they were approaching fast. The sailors raced to leave the port, turning off their radar and shutting down unnecessary equipment to keep noise levels to a minimum while hiding below thermal layers in the ocean waters. Ultimately, the Soviets could not detect Nevada. Still, Operation Atrina had sent a clear message. The Soviets were no longer playing defense. Control over the oceans could soon fall into Soviet hands. The curse begins. Before the Soviet Union's submarine fleet could reach its full potential, the nation started to crack. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolved, and its Soviet Navy, which had once challenged American rule, was at risk of losing all of its power. In a matter of months, dozens of ships stationed in Ukraine were seized by the newly independent nation, stripping Russia of a significant portion of its remaining assets. hard-won naval bases in Cuba, Vietnam, and Syria were abandoned. Hundreds of vessels sat motionless in Russian ports, not for lack of crew, but for lack of fuel, spare parts, and funding. The Russian Federation, drowning in debt, could simply not maintain its naval pride anymore. Military officials refused to let the submarine fleet be among the many casualties of the Soviet collapse. Even with resources dwindling and entire shipyards about to close, the command came down. Nuclear submarine production had to continue at any cost. It was an era of frantic improvisation, corner-cutting, and recklessness. Shipyard workers who hadn't fled due to unpaid wages sounded the alarm. The vessels being built were dangerously compromised. One worker, speaking of the Project 971 fourth-generation submarines, recalled, quote, "There were questions about the quality of the metal used in building the nuclear submarine." Another worker revealed, quote, "When the first trials of the submarine were carried out, water was leaking in between the seams, so it's not surprising that the work dragged on." Amid this problematic era of economic ruin and military uncertainty, 3 new nuclear submarines came to life: K-141 Kursk, K-152 Nerpa, and AS-31. With budgets slashed and oversight crumbling, critical flaws on each vessel were ignored, overlooked, or outright concealed. Although Russian officials were eventually able to get them in the water, the scars from their troubled beginnings would come back to haunt them. The first victim. Kursk was one of the first naval vessels completed after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Launched and commissioned in 1994. Its name was an homage to the Battle of Kursk, where Soviet forces fractured Hitler's campaign on the Eastern Front, taking out between 252 to 323 Nazi tanks in an Allied victory. Among the fleet stationed at Vidyayevo, Kursk stood out as one of the most advanced submarines of its time. As part of the Oscar II class, it was engineered to challenge U.S. carrier battle groups. She was built for lengthy combat beneath Arctic ice. Spacious interiors, a gymnasium, and private cabins ensured that her extensive crew could survive undersea for long periods, navigating silently for days until she found her prey. Once she locked in on the target, Kursk could destroy it using her P-700 Granite cruise missiles, each with a range of 340 miles, capable of flying 12 miles above the ocean before diving at enemy ships in a coordinated, intelligent swarm attack. However, despite her potential, Kursk would not live up to the glory of the battle she was named after. The economic turmoil of the 1990s forced the Russian Navy to keep its deployments to a minimum, and despite possessing some of the most advanced weapons in the world, Kursk would spend most of its operational years rusting by the docks. On August 12, 2000, Russia sought to reclaim its naval pride at Summer X, its largest naval exercise in over a decade. It seemed as if Kursk would finally have a chance to shine. It was still early in the day when her crew was granted permission to conduct a torpedo training launch. They loaded a dummy 6576 kit torpedo into torpedo tube number 4. A faulty weld in the torpedo's casing began to leak high-test peroxide, a volatile chemical that, when exposed to metal, ignites in an instant. The explosion came before the crew even had a chance to react. A fireball ripped through the first compartment, blasting apart the torpedo room, taking out its crew, and blowing open the torpedo tube doors. The blast tore through the bulkhead, separating the first and second compartments, rupturing the control room, and incapacitating key personnel. The force was so great that Norwegian seismic sensors registered a 1.5 magnitude event. For 2 minutes, Kursk remained afloat. Then, there was another explosion. The raging fire inside the stricken sub reached the remaining torpedo warheads, triggering a second detonation, a chain reaction of 5 to 7 warheads. The resulting firestorm erupted with the force of 3 tons of TNT, sending shockwaves across the Barents Sea and registering 4.2 on the Richter scale. A blast so powerful it could be detected in Alaska. The entire forward section of Kursk was obliterated. Compartments 1 through 4 were reduced to twisted metal. The lives of every sailor in those sections were gone in an instant. With the hull breached, Kursk plummeted to the seabed, settling 354 feet below the surface. Of the 118 crew members aboard, only 23 survived the blasts, sealing themselves inside the 9th compartment the last refuge inside the compromised vessel. They were alive only because the nuclear reactors in the fifth compartment had shut down safely. The failed rescue. The emergency buoy that could have transmitted Kursk's exact location had been disabled to prevent accidental deployment. As minutes slipped away, so did any chance of a fast rescue. Britain, Norway, and the United States offered to help retrieve the submarine, but Russia refused, clinging to Cold War-era paranoia and citing national security concerns. For 4 days, the Russian Navy attempted to attach diving bells and submersibles to the escape hatch, ending in one humiliating failure after another. Their equipment was obsolete, their operators unprepared, and the desperate men trapped inside Kursk were running out of time. It wasn't until a whole week after the disaster that Russia finally relented, allowing Norway to send divers to the wreck. But when the team finally pried open the ninth compartment, all hopes were crushed. There were no survivors. The 23 crew members who had taken refuge there had attempted to use Kursk's emergency systems to generate oxygen, but an error triggered a flash fire, suffocating the last survivors. But Russia's initial version of events told a different story. Instead of admitting to an internal failure, officials suggested Kursk had collided with a foreign submarine or a World War II-era mine. According to this version, the explosion was instantaneous, taking the entire crew in a second. No survivors waited for help in vain. For President Vladimir Putin, just 4 months into his presidency, the public condemned his decision to stay on vacation in Sochi while the crisis unfolded. British journalists would write in foreign papers, quote, 24 hours after the submarine's disappearance, as Russian naval officials made bleak calculations about the chances of the 118 men on board. Putin was filmed enjoying himself, shirt sleeves rolled up, hosting a barbecue at his holiday villa on the Black Sea. When Putin finally agreed to meet with the victims' families, alongside Deputy Prime Minister Ilya Klebanov, Nadezhda Telik, the mother of Kursk submariner Lieutenant Sergei Telik, erupted in threats and insults toward them. As she continued her tirade, a woman dressed as a civilian, later identified as a nurse, stepped forward from behind her and plunged a syringe into Telik's arm, injecting her with a sedative. The mother slumped and was carried out of the room. Although TV crews captured the entire scene, it was never broadcast. But the outcry was too great to ignore for much longer. Several high-ranking naval officers, including the head of the Northern Fleet, were dismissed. After years of stubborn isolationism, Russia finally agreed to join NATO-led submarine rescue exercises. Yet, the Kremlin did not halt the deployment of Soviet-era nuclear submarines. The next victim. The construction of K-152 Nerpa began in 1993. However, with funding drying up in the years after the Soviet Union collapsed, the half-built vessel sat still for over a decade, with minimal maintenance and no set date nor guarantee for her deployment. However, after the Kursk tragedy, Russia grew desperate to reinforce its dwindling submarine fleet. With the defense budget stretched thin, the government sought foreign funding to complete the project, and in 2004, India stepped in. A deal was reached. India would provide $670 million to resume construction and testing, on the condition that, once completed, the submarine would be leased to the Indian Navy. By late 2008, after years of setbacks, Nerpa was finally at sea. On paper, she would become the pride of Russia, an 8,140-ton Akula-class submarine equipped with low-noise technology, a maximum submerged speed of 35 knots, and capable of carrying SSN-21 Granite nuclear-capable missiles. But the cracks in her construction were showing from the very beginning. Sea trials exposed serious flaws. Weak seams allowed water to leak in, forcing delays. Yet despite these issues, the trials moved forward. On November 8, 2008, in the Sea of Japan, K-152 Nerpa was conducting her first underwater test run, monitored by 208 people, a mix of 81 military personnel and 127 civilian engineers, commissioned to monitor the construction of Nerpa. At 8:30 p.m., alarms went off. The fire suppression system had suddenly activated, locking down 2 forward compartments. Klaxons shrieked as hatches slammed shut, trapping dozens of crew members as the submarine's automated safety protocols kicked in. R-114B2 gas, a highly toxic refrigerant-based chemical began flooding the compartments. The LOKH fire suppression system, a new and untested model in Russian submarines, had been designed to combat onboard fires by starving them of oxygen and suffocating the flames, along with potentially everyone on board. The gas spread in seconds. For those trapped inside, every breath became lethal. Without oxygen, muscles weakened and vision blurred. Some clawed at escape hatches, while others scrambled to find breathing kits, only to discover there weren't enough to go around. The chilling effect of the gas struck next. Those who managed a breath felt their throats freeze, their lungs burning from within as frostbite took hold. When the gas finally settled, 41 survivors were left gasping for air, many suffering from severe lung damage. 20 others never made it out. Among those who lost their lives were 17 civilian workers who were unfamiliar with submarine escape protocols. 3 Russian Navy personnel perished alongside them, unable to override the malfunction in time. Cover-up. The Russian Navy launched an immediate rescue operation. The Udaloy-class destroyer, Admiral Tributz, and the rescue ship Sayani rushed to retrieve the survivors from the submarine. Despite the tragic loss of life, K-152 Nerpa was able to resurface and return to port on her own. Official statements were almost too optimistic. No structural damage, no radiation leaks, nothing to suggest the submarine had suffered one of Russia's worst naval disasters since Kursk. At first, investigators pointed to a malfunction in the LOKH fire suppression system. This mechanical failure theory aligned with the testimony of a shipyard worker, who later confirmed that the system had experienced issues before the sea trials even began. Despite the dangerous implications, especially with over 200 people aboard, this was not taken into account before sending the submarine into open water. However, the narrative shifted before the blame could be pointed to Russian officials. Days after the disaster, the Russian Navy abandoned its mechanical failure theory. Instead, it turned its focus on a single man, Dmitry Grabov. According to the media, Grabov, acting out of boredom, had meddled with the local control unit, believing it wasn't connected to the active system. Allegedly, he raised the temperature reading from 86 to 172 degrees Fahrenheit, making the submarine read a false fire alarm. When the system requested manual confirmation to activate the fire suppressant, Grabov unknowingly approved it. It was a convenient explanation that allowed Russia to close the chapter on yet another submarine disaster without claiming responsibility. But the story quickly began to crumble. Naval experts were not convinced that a single crew member could have triggered the LOKH system, as the fire suppressant required multiple levels of confirmation. Grabov's colleagues also defended him, insisting he was a highly trained submariner who would never mess with the submarine system and cause an error like that. Still, Grabov was arrested, facing up to 7 years in prison. On September 14, 2011, a jury deemed him not guilty. But the Russian military was not ready to let him go. The Supreme Court's military board overturned the verdict in 2012, ordering a new trial as if determined to force a guilty verdict. Yet in April 2013, Grabov was acquitted once again. With that final ruling, Russia's official story collapsed. Grabov's innocence seemed to confirm what many already suspected, that it was yet another mechanical failure that had caused the Nerpa disaster. The final victim. Just over a decade after the Nerpa disaster, another Russian submarine was deep in crisis. This time, the victim was Project 210, better known as Losharik. Like her unfortunate sisters, Losharik had her beginnings at the height of the Soviet Union's collapse. Her construction began in 1988, but she wouldn't enter service for another 15 years. Losharik was believed to be a sabotage vessel, capable of diving to extreme depths, tapping or even severing undersea communication lines. With its titanium sphere hull, the sub could operate in places no Western submarine could reach, making it the perfect underwater spy. But on July 1, 2019, something went wrong. That night, Losharik was submerged at approximately 300 meters, carrying out an undisclosed mission near Norway. Most of the crew was asleep when the battery compartment erupted in flames. Those on duty were the first to notice. They rushed to grab breathing kits, fighting to contain the flames before they spread to the rest of the ship. As Lasharic burned, the Kremlin stayed silent. Unlike in the previous disasters, where Russia initially fumbled its response, this time it seemed determined to hide the truth entirely, and there were no warnings to the Norwegian officials stationed nearby. Because of this high level of secrecy, the exact details of the incident remain obscured, yet according to sources, it's believed that the sailors tried to control the fire for 40 minutes with little success. As the flames spread, crew members knew they were running out of options. If the fire reached the nuclear reactor, it could trigger a global catastrophe. It's been suggested that some of the submariners chose to sacrifice themselves, sealing off the burning compartment to prevent the fire from consuming the entire sub and causing an underwater atomic blast. Lasharic's mothership, the Delta IV-class sub Podmoskovia, faced an impossible dilemma. Some reports claimed that an explosion had already rocked the vessel, and bringing Lasharic's damaged remains too close could also put the mothership at risk. So they decided to isolate her, possibly flooding Lasharic to contain the risk. Fishermen in the area saw her breaking through the water's surface at 9:30 p.m. A Russian Navy ship and 2 tugs were already waiting for her. Despite refusing to share many details, the Russians admitted to the loss of 14 sailors. State-run news agencies confirmed the fire, but omitted key information, like the nuclear reactor Lasharic carried, or why the sub had been operating in such a sensitive location near Norway's shore. Since the fire in 2019, Lasharic has remained out of commission, but reports suggest it may return to service at some point in 2025. The future of Russia's fleet. The disasters aboard Kursk, Nerpa, and Lasharic have shown the risk of operating submarines built during a time of financial desperation. Yet Russia has not shown any desire to decommission their vessels anytime soon. Despite setbacks, Russia maintains the world's second-largest submarine fleet, trailing only the United States. As of late 2024, Russia operates 64 submarines, at least 31 of them nuclear-powered, many constructed during the turbulent late 1980s and 1990s when the nation struggled to adhere to proper military standards. Now, as these questionable Russian submarines keep on patrolling international waters with nuclear reactors and decades-old systems, many keep a watchful eye, wondering if the next time one of them makes the headlines, it will be the time when their nuclear reactor won't be spared from destruction.